Hello and welcome to this session titled Improving the Long-Term Future, Why and How with Hayden Wilkinson. I'm Elika, I'll be the MC for this session. Following Hayden's presentation, we'll move on to a live Q&A session where Hayden will be responding to your questions. You can submit questions through the swap card live discussion feature, and then after about 45 minutes, we'll bring the session to an end. I'd first like to introduce our speaker for this session. Hayden Wilkinson is a research fellow in philosophy at the University of Oxford's Global Priorities Institute. He holds a PhD from the Australian National University and was formerly a Fulbright Scholar and visiting research fellow at Princeton University. His research centers on the question, how should we evaluate opportunities to do an enormous amount of good with very low probability? Now passing it on to Hayden, thanks.
Thanks, Elika, for the kind introduction. And thank you to all of you for coming along to this session. So in this talk, I'm going to be talking about one way of helping others, namely by improving the long-term future, which may include many different particular interventions. So there are some reasons to think that at least some of those interventions will be especially good opportunities to do good, and also some reasons why you might think that helping future people isn't so promising. I'll also talk a bit about what specific interventions we might take to try and improve the future, but for the most part, I'll be talking in gross generalities. Okay. And before we get started, please, you should note that this talk will be all very introductory and non-technical. So if you've already seen other talks on improving the long-term future, or you've read much philosophical work on this topic, then this may all be familiar to you. If that applies to you, dear listener, and you want to skip out of this session to perhaps catch up on your emails or something, I won't be at all offended. So feel free. But with that out of the way, so to start, suppose you want to help others. Well, there are lots of different ways you might do that. Lots of different interventions you might support with your donations or with your career or whatnot. For instance, direct health interventions in low-income countries, like giving someone a bed net to protect them from malaria, illustrated here by a very cute mosquito, or directly giving money to those who most need it, thereby alleviating extreme poverty, or getting animals off factory farms or otherwise improving their conditions. Cool. Or reducing carbon emissions to mitigate the effects of climate change for our children, our grandchildren, and so on, or doing research and development to prepare for or to prevent future pandemics like COVID, or worse than COVID, and thereby reducing the risk of a global catastrophe. Or even improving democratic institutions to improve people's lives in many different ways at once, a kind of all a multi-pronged approach. So there are lots of different options here, only a small number of which I've actually listed. There's lots of different ways to improve the world. And suppose you want to help others as effectively as you can. Well, then you need to prioritize between these options and all others to find the most effective ones. I'm going to discuss a reason that particularly these three options would be especially effective, and many others that have the same property. Why are they so effective? Well, unlike the others, they have impacts that are more likely to stretch over time, indefinitely far into the future. In a sense, with interventions in this category, you're not just helping one person or one group of people now in the present. Instead, you're helping some people 1 year, some more people the next year, and so on over time, such that you end up helping a vast number of people. So that's what makes them special. Okay, a few notes first. So I'm going to be giving you a case for these sorts of long-term interventions that have this property being especially high impact. But a few notes before that. So first of all, when I talk about positive impact, I'm not just talking about any sort of impact. I'm talking about what's morally good. So this is an ethical concept, a moral concept. I'm not just talking about the sort of impact people might often care about in practice. Like many people might care primarily about making themselves rich or making their family rich, or many people are kind of biased. They care mostly about benefiting people in the same country as them. They don't care about people on the other side of the world. But that's not the sort of impact that I have in mind here. I'm talking about what matters according to morality. And these specific things, it doesn't make that much sense that that's what matters morally. So helping people specifically in their own country, that doesn't seem to have any kind of objective moral basis. And that's not the sort of impact I'm talking about. I'm talking about kind of true moral impact, doing what's actually best. Okay, and second, I'm going to be talking about long-term interventions and the long-term future. I mean really long-term. We're not just talking about 10 years into the future, which we might often think of as the long-term in politics or in the news cycle. I'm also not even talking about, just 100 years into the future, but instead potentially as far as humanity might survive. So maybe, thousands, maybe even millions of years. That's kind of the long term I have in mind. Okay, with that in mind, what's this case that long-term interventions are potentially really high impact? Well, here are three basic claims that, if we accept them, suggest that long-term interventions may be high impact. So first, whatever we do, there may be vast numbers of people across the entire future. Humanity, we're fairly young as a species. We haven't been around that long. And it's entirely possible that we'll survive, another 1,000 years or so, perhaps millions of years. And that's not to say that we should be glad that we'll survive so long. Maybe you're not that impressed by, how humanity is doing. You don't think it's a great thing for us to stick around. But nonetheless, there's a decent chance we will stick around. I'm just stating the fact that we likely will survive a long time. So there likely will be a lot of people's lives in the future affected by our actions today. Okay. Second, future lives matter just as much, no matter how far away they are in time. So just because people live far away from us in time doesn't mean they don't matter. And third, there are ways we can predictably affect those future lives for the better, even on different views of what makes life better. It seems like there are some pretty plausible ways you could do this. So I haven't justified any of these three things yet. That's what I'm going to do now. I'm going to explain each of them in turn, and make the case, together that certain long-term interventions may be very high impact. Okay. So first, the claim that the future contains vast numbers of people. This seems pretty plausible. After all, the future simply is much longer than the present. And that fact alone would be enough to justify this point. But there's also some reason to think that the number of future people is especially vast. To give a sense of just how vast, we can think of this here one icon as representing the approximately 8 billion people who are alive today. And then this is how many people who have lived throughout history, about 100 billion all up. So how does this compare, this number, to how many people might exist in the future? We don't have much evidence for exactly how many people are going to exist over the course of the future, but we have some weak evidence to go on, or we have kind of things we can compare that to, or we have like grounds for making a decent guess. So let's look to our near relatives, like other species of mammals. Typically, mammalian species last for between 500,000 and 6 million years. So far, we've been 200,000 years-ish. So if humanity lasts as long as our relatives do, and even if we do, perhaps you think we've got a particularly large population right now, even if we did happen to drop down to a more sustainable population of just like 1 billion people for the rest of that time, then if we last a few million years, here are how many people could exist over the course of the future, somewhere between 2 trillion and 60 trillion people. And note that I have not managed to fit them all on the slide. There's several more slides worth of people in the bottom of my PowerPoint frame that you cannot see. Basically, there's a lot of them. So this is 20 to 600 times more people than have ever lived. And realistically, this is probably an underestimate of how big the future might possibly be. So in principle, humans aren't just any old mammals. We can work together as a group potentially. We have slightly better technological capability than mice and cats and so on. And there's a decent chance that humanity may get things right, and we may survive much longer than other mammals, perhaps even until the Earth is no longer habitable. Well, then the number of potential future people grows about another 1,000 times more than this. Becomes 100,000 trillion. And if humanity took the next step and somehow managed to spread to other planets, and we outlived the Earth itself, then thousands of times more. But of course, this is all very speculative, and it's not necessary for justifying the claim that there are a lot of people in the future. Even if we don't, spread beyond Earth, even if we stay here, and even if we only last as long as, other species of mammals, then even in that very pessimistic scenario, there would still be 100,000 trillion of us yet to come. So yes, the future could be very big. And it's worth remembering that it's not just very big, it's very full of people who matter and who we might be able to help. So each of those people represented on here, clumped into groups of 8 billion, each of those people, all 100,000 trillion of them, would have a life, much like yours or mine, perhaps full of moments of happiness and joy, and also moments of suffering and misery with people that love them, with goals and desires and struggles just as real as yours or mine. Basic point, there's a lot of people who we might be able to help in the future, many more than happen to be around right now. Okay. And there's also a decent chance that a large proportion of those future people will, in fact, end up existing, no matter what we do. So you might be pessimistic here and think, oh, we're going to wipe ourselves out long before we reach, that very, very long future. Well, decent chance we don't. So people better informed than me about this, actual domain experts, unlike me as a philosopher, have looked into the risks posed by various technologies, various natural phenomena, for instance, asteroids, supervolcanoes, nuclear war, climate change, and so on. And they've tried to come up with rough estimates of how likely it is that those things will wipe us out in the next century or in the centuries after that. So this diagram is taken from, or this table is taken from Toby Ord's book, and he's looking at all different forms of risk. He's looking not just at risk of extinction, but also risk of other sorts of catastrophes. But even then, the probability that something goes awry in the next century, he puts it at about 1 in 6. And that's actually one of the more pessimistic estimates from the literature on this. So the good news for that is probability of about 5 in 6, if not more, that we make it through the century. And perhaps likewise for each future century, conditional on making it to that point. So that means the probability that some very large portion of these 100,000 trillion, I forget how many it is, there's many, many trillions of little green future people, pretty decent probability a large portion of those end up existing. Okay, so that was the first point. That there are likely to be many, many people in the future. But maybe that doesn't matter. After all, even if there were all these lives in the future, if future lives didn't matter morally, or they mattered much less than present lives, then there would be no case for focusing on long-term interventions. But I think there's a good case to be made that future lives do matter, and that they matter roughly as much as present lives. And we can kind of draw that lesson out by looking at some concrete cases. So imagine this case. Suppose there's a childcare or a daycare where young children are sent to spend their days, and some villainous person buries a bomb underneath that daycare. And that bomb is set to explode when the timer runs out. And we can suppose that no one's going to discover this bomb. They've set it, it's guaranteed to go off once the timer runs out. Now, yeah, a few other details. Let's suppose that the children in the daycare are all about 5 years old, and that it's an unsupervised daycare. There are no adults. The only people who will be harmed by the bomb going off are a bunch of 5-year-olds. Now, obviously, I think we can all agree that would be terrible. That would be very bad if someone planted such a bomb and it went off after some time and killed all these 5-year-olds. The question is, would it be any less bad if the timer was a bit longer? So if the timer was set to 1 year, I think still terrible, still equally terrible for this villain to have harmed or maimed all these children 1 year in the future. What about 10 years? And what about 100 years? Well, this case is a little different in that if the only children that go to this daycare at any given time are 5 years old, then if it goes off in 10 years from today, then the only children who will then be harmed or blown up are children that haven't yet been born. So this is a case of harming future people, not harming present people. But I think intuitively, it still seems just as bad. It's no less bad that the timer is set for a little while after these children will actually be born. And likewise, 100 years. There doesn't seem to be a good moral basis for saying that's less bad, or for saying it's any less important if we had the opportunity to remove the bomb, that it's any less important to do so. And I think this reveals a basic point, that on reflection, all future lives matter, no matter how far away in time they happen to be. So we might not often in practice worry about future people, about our grandchildren's grandchildren, or about their grandchildren, but not worrying about them is kind of hard to justify morally. You wouldn't think it was fair yourself if you were forced to live a worse life, or to yourself be one of those poor children in the daycare, just because you were born later than the other people, the people who could actually make the decision. We'd say it was awful if, for instance, all of us today had to suffer because of something done by the ancient Egyptians, even though to the ancient Egyptians we're just future people. From the perspective of someone who doesn't care about future people, they might advise the ancient Egyptians, it's fine, feel free to pollute the environment and destroy everything. It's just future people you're hurting. Yeah. So when we reflect on this, it's really hard, I think, to come up with any moral explanation for why future people should count for any less, just based on when they're born in time. Much like it's hard to justify why people should count differently based on gender or race or sexuality or physical ability, religion, or any other morally irrelevant characteristic. Your exact date of birth, your position in time, seems like it shouldn't count either. Okay. So one thing that some portion of you might think is, but we do often think differently about future things. We do often discount future lives or other future benefits, and it seems fine in other contexts. So in particular, economists and policymakers often discount the value of future monetary benefits. They typically do so at some fixed percentage per year. And often, we don't blink an eye when they do this. So an economist would tell you that it's better to give someone $1,000 today than to give that person $1,000 next year, or to give that person $1,000 in 50 years. Definitely seems better to give it to them today. And this seems plausible. And there's a good motivation for it. That motivation is, if you get the money sooner, you can invest it. Likewise with other resources, you can kind of put them to use, and you can end up with more than $1,000 next year, or more than $1,000 in 50 years. Also gives you more time to spend it. Getting $1,000 at the age of 20 is better than getting $1,000 on your deathbed for obvious reasons. Okay, but these justifications don't work when we're talking about actually benefiting future people. So we're talking about benefiting future people, increasing their well-being, making their lives better. That sort of thing isn't a resource like money that we want to spend to obtain other things that we actually care about. Someone's life going well is what we actually care about in the first place. So there's no investing that. It's not a merely instrumental good. It's the ultimate thing we're looking for. And so there's no this earlier motivation that, oh, you can get it sooner, you can use it to get more of the actual good stuff. Well, no, this is the good stuff itself. There's no such motivation for discounting it. Okay. So that was the second point, that future lives matter, and they matter just as much as present people. I don't think there's good justification for saying they don't. But some might disagree. It's at least maybe mildly controversial. It's not kind of a common sense thought. But accepting that, we come to the third point. So after all, it wouldn't matter that there were lots of future people or that those future people mattered if we had no way of helping them. If we couldn't do anything to affect their lives, or we couldn't do anything to affect them in a predictable way. So that's why we need the third point. And indeed, many ways we affect the future are unpredictable. For instance, if you save someone's life here and now, that person might go on to have children, and then one of their descendants in 1,000 years, that person's a great inventor or a philanthropist or a political leader or an activist, and they solve some global problem. And that's great. Or one of their descendants could be a terrible person who commits atrocities and makes things worse. And that's bad. Well, which of those things is actually going to happen if you save someone's life today? You just have no way of knowing. It's almost completely unpredictable. It's almost completely random which one comes about. But other things we can do don't seem like that. There are other things that do seem predictably good or bad for the future. Not predictable in the sense that we can be certain that they'll be good or bad, but predictable in the sense that they're far more likely to be good than they are to be bad, which makes them overall like a pretty good bet to take. So in particular, we can do things that are irreversible or really hard to reverse, what you could call lock-in events, because they lock us into particular futures. Or, we could prevent lock-in events from happening, prevent things that lock us into a bad future. So I'll give some concrete examples of this, because this may not make sense. So there are some things that once implemented are very hard to change, like laws or a country's constitution. In the case of the US Constitution, it's been around for 300 years or so. I don't know exactly how long, but once implemented, this thing has been very hard to change. And the country's been stuck with the exact wording of much of this document in legal force for many hundreds of years. So a decision maker with the ability to change a decision maker who was originally in the position to change the wording of that document, they could have had a very long lasting effect on the exact laws of the country. Yeah, because that law is kind of a lock-in. Another lock-in event, a kind of maybe smaller scale one, is hard to remove contaminants. So if you dump some nuclear waste in the wilderness near your house, well, that's locking the future into a state where that wilderness near your house has contaminants in it for a very long time because those things are so hard to remove. Likewise, if you prevent someone from releasing contaminants, then you kind of preserve or potentially preserve that bit of wilderness for a very long time. Okay, so the kind of classic example of a lock-in effect, lock-in event, one that is extremely predictable, is human extinction. So if all the humans die, then it's very predictable that there then won't be any humans for a very long time, perhaps until we re-evolve, something like us re-evolves or something. But yeah, it would take a very long time. So events that wipe out all of humanity, those are kind of locked in for a very long time, or they lock in a particular future. You may or may not think that's a bad future. You might think that humans are kind of not particularly good for the world, but nonetheless, this is, in some sense, does lock in a particular sort of future. And some people do think, extinction would be very, very bad, so it's a bad future. It's also, you might think global collapses kind of have this feature as well. So if human civilization kind of crumbled, if we had a nuclear war and we were effectively kind of set back to the Stone Age in terms of technological capability and in terms of kind of civilizational, societal structure and institutions and so on, you might think it would be very hard to reorganize and, redo the Industrial Revolution and so on and get back to where we currently are, talking on Zoom and whatnot. A global nuclear war that resulted in global collapse, you might think, okay, that's going to lock us into being in kind of Stone Age conditions for many thousands of years. Yeah, and examples of things that people, experts in the relevant fields, suggest pose actual risks of extinction or collapse are things like especially bad pandemics, especially pandemics arising from engineered pathogens, things that people have cooked up in labs to be especially lethal. Nuclear war poses some risk of this. Worst case, runaway climate change as well. Some people suggest AI scenarios, but there's a bit more debate about that one. Okay, another category, changes that once implemented, few people will naturally want to change. So for instance, improving or worsening institutions. If you implement a good institutions that are more democratic, more resistant to war, to great risks like climate change, more resistant to authoritarianism, then you might think that people get used to it. People quite like the benefits of such institutions, and they choose to keep them around. Especially with democratic institutions, people might consistently continue voting to keep things democratic. Of course, they might not, but in some cases, you might think that is kind of a lock-in effect. Also, there would be lock-in events of implementing bad institutions. So perhaps making a country's government particularly autocratic, particularly oppressive. And if that country happened to be especially resilient to outside influences, especially kind of self-sufficient, then those who are in power in that kind of authoritarian state, first, they would likely want to stay in power, and so they would try and perpetuate that regime. And if it was sufficiently self-sufficient as a country, then they might be able to, stick around for a very long time, causing centuries of misery for lots of people, because it's quite a resilient state. Okay. Another such change, improving or worsening human values. If everyone became kind of more altruistic, then they would teach this altruistic values to their children, perhaps, and this might carry on for a very long time. And likewise, teaching, if everyone kind of adopted quite horrible values, then they might teach those to their children, and these would also carry on. So these might be the sorts of things that people would be effectively locked in for a long time because people wouldn't want to change them, or they would kind of perpetuate themselves. Okay, so this whole list, giving you a big old list of lock-in events, possible lock-in events, some of which lock us into a good future, in which case it might be very high impact to cause that lock-in to happen, and some that might cause very bad futures, in which case it would be very good to prevent that lock-in from happening, or just reduce the risk of it. So reducing the risk of the most deadly pandemics, reducing the risk of stable authoritarian governments, those things might be extremely good if there's some risk of them happening, and if we have the means to prevent them. And so, at least in principle, it seems that there are some ways of predictably improving the future. Okay, if we want to focus on the most important such ways, here's one kind of rough way to carve up the most effective such ways of improving the future. Again, not based on this, I'm just a philosopher, this isn't based on my own work. I'm kind of appealing to people far more knowledgeable than me, who have actually, are subject subject experts in these areas and have actually looked into these things. So two very broad categories of ways that you might think one could improve the future: mitigating extinction risks and trajectory changes. So first, human extinction. You might think that extinction would itself be a very bad thing because it's bad for all those future people who never get a chance to live. Then, by your lights, preventing extinction would have enormous value. But you might not care about extinction. Even then, you'll likely still care about improving the lives of future people who will exist, regardless of if they're going to exist either way, then you want their lives to be better. And that's what we might call a trajectory change, changing the future trajectory of human civilization in like a positive way, such that people's lives are better. Okay. And here are some kind of key extinction risks or key means of reducing extinction risk that researchers kind of from around the EA community have proposed and have some pretty good, seemingly good arguments for. Preventing large-scale pandemics, preventing nuclear war, preventing kind of unaligned AI accidents, and preventing worst-case climate change all seem like they have the potential to pretty effectively mitigate risks of extinction. And trajectory changes, there are some other things as well, like changing values of humanity at large or improving institutions like national governments and justice systems in certain ways that might consistently make future lives better. And of course, this is an overly simplistic picture. Really, all of these things affect all the other things. So if you prevent the worst case pandemics, that not only makes it less likely that we go extinct, plausibly, but it also makes life better for many of the people who do exist, because there are lots of pandemics that are really bad that don't kill everyone. Like we've just lived through one. So preventing something like COVID from ever happening again, that would also be a nice trajectory change, in addition to having this effect on extinction. By preventing it. And likewise, things on the other side, values change and improving institutions. Better institutions are better able to deal with pandemics and nuclear war and so on. So any one of these things kind of benefits both sides. Okay. Okay. I should say something at least somewhat more concrete about what us as individuals, what we as individuals can do in our everyday lives to ourselves make a difference on these very big issues. So far it's been in fairly broad strokes. Well, one thing almost all of us can do is donate money to charities that are working on these issues. So donating to charities or advocacy groups that are that are advocating for policies that reduce the risk of major pandemics seems pretty good. Political advocacy, either advocating yourself for the right for policies that benefit these things, or merely voting for those policies also seems pretty good. But I think the most important of all of these three things is careers. So there are all sorts of careers that any one of us, if we're at an early stage in our career, that we could choose to go into that might have an outsized impact on the world via improving the long term. So for instance, going into technical research work on biosecurity measures or on climate solutions or on AI, these are highly recommended by some EA careers evaluators. There's also more abstract research work, slightly more divorced from practice, but still potentially quite important. So on kind of pandemic response measures, on nuclear diplomacy, on AI governance, on the general kind of philosophical theory of long-term effects and how we should evaluate them. Also on prediction methods for better predicting the long-term effects of different actions. Also all sorts of policy work that seems quite important, and many more. And I'm just going to put you all to some much more detailed analysis at 80,000hours.org because they are a much better authority on this than me. But for the argument I want to make, it seems like, yes, there are some pretty promising methods of us as individuals positively influencing the future. Okay, so that was the case for at least some long-term interventions being high impact. Those 3 points there. Now, you might doubt any one of these three claims, that there are vast numbers of future people, that future lives matter just as much, and so on. If you doubt any of these, then you may think that long-term interventions aren't especially impactful, and that's fine. Or you might accept them and think, yes, okay, long-term interventions do look pretty good, at least some of them. Or you might not only accept these principles, but you might think it justifies an even kind of stronger conclusion. You might think that, well, this justifies long-term interventions being a really, really big deal, like at least as high impact as any other short-term interventions we have available to us. So in other words, you might accept this further principle, which you may have come across before in kind of EA discussions, and that is long-termism. The idea that positively influencing the long-term future is one of the key moral priorities of our time. Another way to put this is in at least some sorts of moral decisions that we should focus on positively influencing the long-term future. Now, each of these is a philosophical principle. It's fairly abstract, but it has been fairly influential, and you may have kind of come across discussions of long-termism within the EA community. It spurred many people this belief that attempts to influence the long-term future may be especially impactful. In fact, the most impactful thing we could do. That idea has kind of spurred many people in the EA community to take on high-impact careers and get into volunteering and political advocacy and donations to try and improve the future. Okay, but this idea is often misinterpreted or misrepresented, so I'd like to clarify a few things that this doesn't say and that I don't think anyone is, I don't think many people are kind of defending. So these more radical views that long-termism does not say. One is, it doesn't say that improving the future is the greatest moral priority, at least not necessarily. It could just be one priority among many, and it might still be, roughly as high a priority as like alleviating poverty and disease in the world today. Long-termism just says that improving the future should be on a similar footing, not that it's far and away more important. Now, you might think that it should, in fact, be the only priority on our list, but that would be a much less plausible and a much more controversial idea. And I don't think it's a principle that is anywhere near as popular in the EA community as the basic idea that, yeah, long-term interventions are pretty important. They may not be the most important, but there is a case that they're pretty important. Okay. A further thing that long-termism doesn't say is that in all moral decisions, we should do whatever improves the long-term future most. For instance, doing whatever is necessary, whatever that might be. So for instance, if there was some way that harming people in the present or committing some kind of injustice or horrible atrocity would help us improve the future, long-termism doesn't say that we should do those horrible things. Just because the future is important doesn't mean that we should do bad things for the sake of the future. Just like environmentalism says that the environment is really important, and feminism says that gender equality is really important, but they don't necessarily say that we should harm people to save the environment or that we should commit injustices to achieve gender equality. Likewise, long-termism doesn't say anything like that. It just says that in some situations, perhaps all of the situations where we can do so without harming anyone, we should try to improve the long-term future. Okay, and there's a further point, which I kind of already made, one thing long-termism doesn't directly say is that the best way to improve the long-term future is to mitigate risks of extinction. So there is at least, some philosophical debate about, how bad extinction is. You might not think extinction is terribly bad because there's no one around to be sad about it, or no one around to kind of suffer. And yeah, there's a legitimate debate to be had there, but long-termism doesn't rest on extinction being, the one big thing. Many long-termists care about extinction and think extinction would be bad, but, that's much more controversial than just long-termism, as stated, that, we should help future people in whatever constitutes, valuably helping people. Okay. So I think I have a little bit of time to rush through some kind of responses one might have to long-termism and to this general case in favor of long-term interventions being impactful. Note that you don't have to think that long-termism is true to think that these interventions are impactful. These are kind of two slightly separate things. But the first kind of objection one might raise, which you hear sometimes, is that, well, to say that long-term effects matter requires long-termism, and long-termism requires some stronger moral theory like utilitarianism. And I should note that utilitarianism is, I won't kind of explain exactly what it is here, but it's a kind of fairly controversial moral theory among philosophers, and not one that I think many people endorse. So basically, the answer to this objection is very straightforward. Not at all. Clearly, you can think that long-term effects matter, that there's lots of future people, and if we can help them, we should, without thinking that this ends up being the most important thing we could do. And also thinking that this is the most important thing you could do doesn't imply that you accept a very particular moral theory, including this one. So a wide range of moral views, it turns out, including but not only utilitarianism, imply long-termism. and an even wider range imply that long-term effects matter. Okay. Oh no. Okay. Basically, the basic point is, as long as it's important to make other people's lives better and position in time, that's not morally relevant, then improving the long-term future is in principle important. As long as there are ways to do that, then it is in fact, pretty valuable to do. Okay. We'll get to some better objections in a bit. Okay. A second objection that I think is actually quite a good one is this. Any ways that we as individuals might try to improve the long-term future are risky. There's a high probability that whatever I try and do won't make any difference, that it won't actually succeed. So to kind of make this concrete, imagine a way that you could improve the future. Okay, preventing pandemics, which let's say, and I'm just making these numbers up. I'm doing the old philosophy thing of not bringing in kind of real data whatsoever, but here's some made up numbers. Probability of 1 in 1,000, that if you do this, that a catastrophic pandemic, that would make the future much worse, and that pandemic was going to happen, and that your efforts in fact prevent it, saving 70 trillion lives or something in the long term. And then the remaining probability, 999 out of 1,000, your efforts will go to waste. There wasn't actually going to be a pandemic, or at least if there was, your actions make no difference to it. So I think that's roughly the situation we're in when we go out and we try to prevent future pandemics by implementing policies that we think are good. Tiny probability of success, but if it is successful, there's a huge payoff. But most likely, we won't be successful. Okay. Another option, which you might like more, is saving lives now. So you donate to, say, a global health charity or a poverty alleviation charity. And let's suppose that this is guaranteed to save or improve maybe 1,000 lives in the short term for the same cost that you could have this probability of preventing pandemics. Yeah, so this seems like roughly the sort of situation we're in. And you might think that one is better, you might think the other is better. There's some theoretical reason for thinking preventing pandemics is better, and that's this kind of expected value reasoning. And that's kind of taking the average benefit that your action will have. So the average here is going to be, the benefit multiplied by the probability. So preventing pandemics has what we call an expected value of 70 trillion lives saved or improved, multiplied by a probability of 1 in 1,000, plus saving 0 lives with a probability of 999 in 1,000. So that averages out to 70 billion lives saved, which seems like a big number, and more lives saved or improved than saving lives now. But the thing is, expected value reasoning, that may not be true. That's just one way of kind of looking at these situations. You could instead be risk averse. So you could prefer getting a good outcome for sure. You could put extra weight on the worst case outcomes. Like you could put extra weight on this possibility of making no difference whatsoever. You may prioritize having at least some difference. So risk aversion seems to lead you towards saving lives now. And that's it's a reasonable position to take, I think. Okay, but there is some argument against this. So let's take an analogy. Suppose your house has a probability of 1 in 10 of burning down. You could buy a fire extinguisher to completely prevent this. Again, numbers are being made up. That's okay. So if you buy the fire extinguisher, you have a probability of 9 in 10 that your purchase makes no difference. Your house was never going to burn down. And there's a probability of 1 in 10 that your house was going to burn down, but now that you've got a fire extinguisher, you can stop it from burning down. This is a very effective fire extinguisher for some reason. Okay, and another option you might have is buy pizza, a certainty of your purchase making you happier. Whether or not your house burns down, you know that buying the pizza will make you happy because you enjoy eating pizza. So this is roughly analogous to the previous situation of preventing pandemics or saving lives now. The impact you have by buying the fire extinguisher is risky, low probability of it having an impact, whereas buying a pizza is kind of guaranteed to have an impact. But the thing is, it's not. This doesn't seem kind of the rational thing to do if you're averse to risk, if you're risk averse, if you're worried about the worst case outcome. Because the worst case outcome here isn't having no impact. The worst case outcome is your house burning down, as long as that's what you actually care about. So we can rewrite this case like this. Buy the fire extinguisher and you have a certainty of your house not burning down, spend money on pizza, and there's a probability of 9 in 10 that your house doesn't burn down and you enjoy the pizza, and a probability of 1 in 10 that your house does burn down, but at least you have pizza. And I think this is two different ways of framing the same case. And likewise, we could frame, pandemics versus saving lives now in either way as well. And I think the more appropriate framing is the second one, because that's actually representing what we really care about, which is, how many people live or die, whether or not your house gets burned down. And so saying that preventing pandemics is a very risky strategy to take, well, there's some argument to be made against that. Well, actually, not preventing pandemics is even riskier because there remains a risk of pandemics. And what we actually care about are lots of people dying, as against how much impact I individually made. But of course, that's your mileage may vary with that argument and that response. So risk aversion may still be an objection against long-term interventions. It may kind of reduce the potential impact of them, at least in the way we care about. Okay, another response, which I think is also very valid, is the probabilities are just too low when we're taking long-term interventions. So you might think that all of the ways that you or I could affect the long-term future just have too low a probability of paying off. It's not so much risk aversion here. It's not that we're extra worried about the worst case outcome. It's just that we think that when probabilities get low enough, we just it's irrational to pay any attention to them whatsoever. So if you only have, a 1 in a trillion probability of saving the world from a pandemic by focusing on pandemics, you might think, okay, the probability is just too low. It would be irrational to bet everything on that. And this is a slightly different issue from risk aversion. And now there are some philosophical arguments against ignoring low probabilities and in favor of, taking the bet, even if probabilities are very low, which we don't really have time for here. But here's one thing I'd kind of invite you to consider when thinking about this sort of objection, and that is, okay, the probability of one person, of you individually improving the future might be tiny, but you're not the only person trying to do it. You're one of many people in the EA community, at least, also more widely, trying to make a difference. And it might be that each one of those people by themselves has a very low probability of success, but the probability of at least one of us together succeeding is much, much higher. So it would be kind of, in fact, the probability, if everyone in that group instead focused on kind of short-term guaranteed options, the probability that would be worse than everyone focusing on the kind of risky options is pretty high. It's actually quite a safe bet for everyone to switch to risky options because the probability of at least one person succeeding is very high. And if you care about how much impact we're having as a community, then this makes the probabilities always be quite high. Okay, but that's just kind of a tentative response, which may or may not be persuasive. So I've said a bunch of things. We've given a kind of case in favor of long-term interventions being quite impactful. We've given a case against them being impactful. And also, I've given you hopefully a little bit of context of, this idea of long-termism that you often hear about in the EA community, which kind of roughly matches up to the view that long-term interventions are sometimes really important, kind of on a par with other interventions, if not better. So yeah, we've still got a little bit of time for questions, I think. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Amazing. Thanks, Hayden. We only have a couple minutes, and so reminder to post your questions in swap card, and I'll get it started with a really popular question, which is, do you think that pursuing the implementation of unconditional universal basic income policy could be an effective legitimist priority?
Plausibly, yes, but I am not an economist and don't have any kind of special insight there. I think so one thing I could say, which I kind of stand by, is that it seems plausible enough that further research into whether it kind of has a kind of long-term positive impact, that research would be very valuable. I think with many kind of potentially good long-term interventions, often it's a better strategy to, for now, do research on them to figure out just how effective they are in the long term, and that before going ahead and going full steam ahead and implementing the thing widely. But there also may already be such evidence that it's really good in the long term. I don't know.
Amazing. Okay, this next one is a paraphrased version of a longer question that was in Swap Card. So there's an argument that the short-termist is long-termism, since interventions like the Against Malaria Foundation and Give Directly not only help people living now, but help in the long term by changing their trajectory counterfactually. What would your response to be? What would your response to this be? So
Yeah,
short-termist interventions helping in the long term.
yeah, it's a good question. I think it's very plausible that the very best interventions from a long-termist standpoint are also extremely promising in the short term. So things like preventing the absolute worst pandemics, which also happens to help prevent the kind of moderately bad pandemics, prevent things like COVID. And yeah, that does look pretty good from a short-term perspective. I'm not sure the case is that strong for just directly saving lives from neglected tropical diseases. Like clearly very good from a short-term perspective, and also very good from a kind of risk-averse perspective, you might think, or at least a certain sort of risk-averse perspective. But I'm not sure how good the evidence is that this also has robustly positive long-term effects. I'd be like slightly surprised if it did. That'd be a strange coincidence. But yeah, I don't know the relevant evidence, and I don't know either way.
Amazing, thanks. All right, we have time for like two more questions. So one popular question is, some argue that the Fermi paradox could likely mean that intelligent species like humans will eventually be subject to a great filter extinction. If this is true, then the expected number of people living in the future is drastically lower. Obviously, we could still argue that the number is still so huge that long-termism dwarfs other cause areas, but how would you respond to this?
Yeah, so I don't know too much about great filter arguments, or at least the kind of discussion of them that's taken place in places like Less Wrong. But my impression is that it's not clear that if there is a great filter, that great filter is ahead of us. It might be that it is surprising that we're the only intelligent species that we're the only planet populated by an intelligent species that we've spotted. We haven't noticed any others floating about. And that might be because, at some point between now and us making it to the stars, there's some great filter, some sort of catastrophic event that we should be wary of. Or it might be that, just some point in prior human evolution, that thing was really unlikely. For instance, us, some point where like human brain size suddenly jumped up, or where we kind of, rubbed two sticks together and managed to make a spark, or whatever it might be. I don't think we have like strong evidence either way, at least until we spot less intelligent alien life. If we, perhaps if we found, bacteria on Mars, or frogs on Mars, or something that hasn't quite reached the technological heights of humanity, then we think, so it's relatively easy to get to that point. That suggests that the great filter is later on. I don't think it's clear that the great filter is so late, at least until we find, bacteria on Mars, or, frogs on Mars, or other planets. But maybe there are arguments I just don't know about.
Yeah, amazing. And we have time for one more. I've lumped this together as a question. What's your best piece of advice for the audience, knowing that it's presuming the audience is like mostly new to this space? And what books or articles would you recommend to the audience?
So I'm not sure if my screen is still visible, but basically those ones that are on the screen. Thank you. Thank you, Paul. So What We Owe the Future by Will MacAskill, basically sketches out the same arguments that I've made today. The Precipice by Toby Ord dives into kind of more kind of concrete empirical work on exactly how would say a nuclear war kill us all, and why is that likely? What is the probability, and so on. And also gives a bit of concrete advice for individuals. But I think the best source for concrete practical advice for you or I is 80,000 Hours. I suspect they're probably giving a talk at some point during this conference. If not, check out their website. They have kind of detailed analysis of different options for careers that one might follow. Also, if anyone's particularly interested in kind of academic papers on this stuff, then special plug for my own workplace and the research we produced. The links there on the slide.
Amazing. And with that, I'd like to give a big thank you, Hayden, to presenting.
Thanks so much.
For everyone else, stick around. We'll have our next session coming up shortly.